Well, today we're going to add solar. As you can see, I've already put the solar panel on top. I'm using 1.5-inch solar panel cradles. Those are the white pieces that are glued onto the roof. I'm using a high capacity adhesive there. And this is a 200-watt panel. I only wanted to do one panel because in front of it over here, I'm going to have a fan that is both in and out as far as air. So I wanted to save room for that. And now we got to talk about, after I've got the solar panel, what are we going to do with the energy and how are we going to do it? So stay tuned. So this is the back of our van. We've already built the bed. You saw the video on that one. So what I've created here, this is a battery box. This is where my 200 amp hour gel matte battery, AGM battery, will be. But I need to put a what's called a solar tray. And that's where all my components and most importantly the breakers. And so where I'm going to put that is right here. I'm going to have to cut a piece of wood that goes right in here. And you'll see that here in a second. So here's a piece of wood that I've cut out to go right back there where I was pointing. And on this, you'll see I'm going to start to place out my solar components on this piece of wood, which is the terminology they use is the solar tray. So here we go. So I'm going to try to do this with one hand. So the first thing we need to do is place a breaker right here. And this is so that when the solar panel wires come into the van, the first thing they do is they hit a breaker. That's in case there's some extraneous charge that comes from the solar panels that we're not expecting. It's just like at home. We have breaker boxes usually in our basements or in a room somewhere, and we hope that our electricity is always good, but if there's a spike for some reason, it trips a breaker. Same thing with the solar panel. So the first thing is the solar panel breaker from the panels. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add another breaker, because once it comes from there, from this breaker, it'll go up into a controller, which is on the inside of the van. After the van, the wires come back from the controller and back to the board, and that's where we're going to add a second breaker, because this time this breaker is protecting the van from the amperage from the controller box inside the van. You'll notice that both of these are 30 amp, and the reason is that the controller, which is an MPPT controller, is 30 amps. Next thing we want to do is we want to add a fuse block. And a fuse block allows us to put different components that we want to add that use battery power without connecting them directly to the battery. So this fuse block has, these are all positive, and it has a built-in negative bus bar, so these are all negatives. So my positive and negative wires come in, and they will connect to this. And of course, this whole fuse block will end up connecting to the battery. But that way we only have a positive and negative coming down to the battery, which the battery box is over here, as you saw inside the van. But there's only 2 wires coming down rather than a dozen wires. And like everything else, we have to protect the fuse block with another breaker. So we're going to put that breaker right here. And so the positive coming from the fuse block will also hit this breaker before it comes down to the battery. Again, this is really perhaps overkill, but I like to make sure there's lots of blocks. And as you can see, the panels that I'm using are breakers. So they also act, not only will they trip, but I can disconnect right here as I hit the trip. So they are also disconnects and fuses, breakers, all at the same time. And that's why I have all of those. By the way, I'm using a 50 amp because it comes off of this fuse block, which is rated for 50 amps. Anything higher, it'll trip. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to add my inverter. So I have a 3000, 6000 pure sine wave inverter. You can see it there. There's the front of it. It also has its own nice little block that I will put some outlets inside the van. And this inverter will go directly to the battery. So, of course, you know me, I like to protect it. And so recommended, each inverter will have a recommended fuse or breaker. And so the one recommended for this inverter is over here, and that's going to be a 300 amp fuse or breaker. And so it'll go from the positive of the inverter, it'll come down to the positives of this breaker, and then from here it'll come down to the battery. So that there, my friends, represents the initial components of the solar tray. All I have to do now is connect some wires. Okay, so we've got everything wired. I've got my fuse block ready, and that's all positive. This is negative to the battery, positive. Going to my 50 amp breaker, and this will go to the battery. Still waiting on my cables for solar. This is solar from the panels, and this is solar from the controller to the battery. And then ultimately my inverter, 3000, 6000 inverter, and we're gonna go to the van. And finally, here it is finished. So I've got my fuse block wires coming to the battery. And as I move in here, you can see there's the fuse block and the panel, the tray. Everything's ready to go to hook up everything. And all of this, as you can see, is underneath the van as I back away. All out of the way for storage. And now we can concentrate on the inside of the van.